The sun was barely up when the wind carried the scent of dust and old iron through the small frontier town. A line of horses stood tied along the rail outside the trading post, their breath rising in thin clouds. Inside it was quieter than a church. Only the shuffle of boots and the creak of a stool broke the stillness. Behind the counter, the old shopkeeper counted his coins while a man in a brown hat stood silent, watching the room as though he didn't belong to it. His coat was worn, the kind men wear after months of trail riding, and his hands showed the scars of work that didn't always go clean. His name wasn't known to many, but most called him the cowboy. He had come a long way, following whispers about a trade that wasn't right. In the far corner of the trading post sat a group of men who didn't look like ranchers or settlers. They talked low and sharp, and between them stood a girl, barefoot, her wrists wrapped in rough rope, her dark hair tangled and heavy with dust. Her eyes didn't move from the floor, but the faint tremor in her shoulders showed she was awake to every sound. She was an Apache captive, brought in from the southern plains after a raid that left both sides bleeding. Folks said she was worth something to the army scouts, maybe even more to the traders who knew where to sell fear. The shopkeeper didn't ask questions. He just waited for payment, same as always. The cowboy stepped forward, slow and steady. Every bootfall made the men turn their heads. He reached into his pocket and dropped $3 silver on the counter. The sound rang clear, sharper than the air outside. "For her," he said. No one spoke for a moment. The men looked at him, then at the money, then at the girl. The oldest of them spat tobacco near the stove and grinned. $3, he said. "That's all she's worth to you?" The cowboy didn't answer. He just kept his gaze on the rope around her wrists. The girl finally looked up, her eyes dark and fierce like she'd been born of the storm. "I'd rather die," she said, her voice steady as a drawn knife. The room fell quiet again. No one knew what kind of man would pay for another's freedom with so little said. Maybe he was a fool, maybe worse. But when the cowboy took the rope in his hand and cut it loose, he didn't smile, didn't even look proud. He just turned toward the door and said, "You can walk or you can stay. Either way, I ain't leaving you here." The men laughed behind him, muttering about how some folks didn't understand the land they lived in. The girl didn't move. Her bare feet stayed planted on the rough wooden floor, her eyes still locked on him like she couldn't decide if he was her enemy or her chance at living. Outside, the wind had picked up, rolling dust across the empty street. The cowboy waited beside his horse, the silver on his saddle dull from travel. He didn't look back until he heard the faintest sound, footsteps. She had followed him, her arms folded close, her jaw set. He nodded once, slow, and mounted up. She climbed behind him without a word, gripping the back of the saddle like she was holding onto the edge of the world. The town faded behind them as they rode toward the red hills. The trail was quiet except for the sound of the horses' hooves on the hard ground. She hadn't asked where they were going, and he hadn't told her. Every few miles she'd glance at him, then away, as if trying to read the truth of his face. His eyes stayed forward, focused on the horizon. When the sun climbed higher, the desert began to shimmer, and a hawk circled above them, its cry sharp against the silence. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled from a sky that didn't yet show a cloud. The girl spoke first. "You should have left me," she said. "They'll come for me." The cowboy didn't turn. "Let them try," he said, and that was all. By midday, they reached a shallow canyon where an old creek ran thin between the rocks. He stopped there, letting the horse drink, then handed her a canteen. She stared at it before taking a sip, her fingers trembling just enough to betray the fear she was trying to bury. "You don't know who I am," she said softly. "You don't know what happens to those who help me." The cowboy leaned against a boulder, watching the horizon. "Maybe not," he said, "but I've seen worse things done to those who didn't help." For a moment, neither spoke. The desert wind moved through the dry grass like a whisper of ghosts. The girl sat down by the water, pulling her knees close. Her eyes were somewhere far away, maybe the village she'd lost, maybe the grave she couldn't visit. The cowboy watched her without asking. He'd seen that kind of look before. Folks who'd been through fire and come out with their heart still beating carried it, like a scar you couldn't see but never forgot. The sun shifted, throwing long shadows across the rocks. He took off his hat, wiped the dust from his brow, and said quietly, $3 ain't much for a life." She looked at him then, something sharp and searching in her gaze. "You didn't buy me," she said. "You just made yourself a target." He gave a faint nod. "Reckon that's true." When night began to fall, they made camp near the canyon wall. The fire burned low, and the sound of crickets filled the silence between them. She wrapped herself in a blanket he'd given her, though her eyes stayed open, watching the flames. He sat nearby, his rifle across his knees, listening to the distant howl of coyotes. The stars came out clear and cold. Somewhere in the dark, a horse whinnied softly, uneasy. The cowboy's head turned, his hand tightening on the rifle. The girl saw it too, the faint flicker of light far off in the desert, like another fire where there shouldn't be one. She whispered, "They're following us." He didn't answer. He just rose to his feet, every muscle drawn tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a sound that wasn't the night. Hooves, distant, but growing. She rose slowly, her face pale in the firelight. "You should leave me," she said again, this time with urgency. "They won't stop." The cowboy shook his head. "I ain't in the habit of giving people back to devils." He kicked sand over the fire, dousing it in a hiss, and motioned for her to grab what she could. The horse stirred as he saddled it, the leather creaking in the dark. She hesitated only a moment before climbing up behind him again. The desert opened before them, wide and silent, as they rode into the black stretch of night. Behind them, the faint glow of torches appeared against the hills, small at first, then growing. The sound of shouting drifted on the wind. The cowboy urged his horse faster, the rhythm of hooves pounding like a heartbeat in the dark. The girl clung tighter, her breath sharp against the back of his neck. The land around them blurred into shadow. The chase had begun. Far ahead, the moon broke through the clouds, painting the land in silver. For a moment, the cowboy's face caught the light, steady, unafraid. But in the girl's eyes there was something else, a tear that slipped free, not of fear but of something deeper, older. She didn't know what waited for them beyond the hills. She only knew one truth now, that a stranger had paid $3 for her life, and the price was far from over. The horse's hooves beat the desert floor in a steady rhythm that sounded like thunder in the silence of the night. The wind pulled at the cowboy's coat, stinging his face with sand. The girl clung behind him, her grip tight, her breathing uneven as the distant torches faded behind them. The desert stretched endless under the pale light of the moon, miles of rock and sagebrush with nowhere to hide. Yet the cowboy didn't slow down. His mind was set on reaching the old mission ruins by dawn, a place few dared to go but one he remembered from long rides and longer nights. It wasn't safety, but it was cover. And tonight, that was enough. By the time the eastern sky began to gray, both rider and horse were spent. The girl slid off the saddle, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. She looked small under the wide sky, the blanket still clutched around her shoulders. The cowboy dismounted and led the horse toward a cluster of old stone walls half buried in time. The air smelled of dust and ash, a reminder of how long the world had been burning out here. He checked the horizon, nothing but wind and emptiness for miles. He turned back to her. "We'll rest here a while," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't speak, her eyes scanning the ruins like she half expected ghosts to come out of them. He started a small fire using dry brush from the walls and gave her a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. She took it, chewing slowly, her gaze still distant. For a while neither spoke. The sun rose slowly, washing the land in pale gold. She finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come for me," she said. "You don't even know who I am." He looked at her from across the fire. "Maybe not," he said. "But I know what they were doing wasn't right." She frowned, confusion and disbelief mixing in her eyes. "You think you're a savior, cowboy? You think you can buy a life with $3? Her words carried anger, but her voice trembled beneath it. He stared at the fire a long time before answering. "No," he said quietly. "I just couldn't watch another one get sold." Her head tilted slightly. "Another one?" He didn't look up. "You're not the first I've seen chained for someone else's profit. Won't be the last." She studied him carefully, noticing the weariness behind his calm. "You've lost someone," she said. He didn't reply, but his silence spoke louder than any answer could. The morning light caught his face, and she saw it then, a pain buried deep, the kind that never truly fades. She didn't ask again. Hours passed, the desert heat rising until the air shimmered. He checked his rifle, then his horse's shoes, making sure everything was ready. The girl stayed in the shadow of the crumbling wall, running her fingers through the dust. She whispered something in her language, low and rhythmic, almost like a prayer. The cowboy glanced over. "What's that mean?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "It means the earth remembers what men forget." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she thought he would. When the heat grew too heavy, he poured her some water from the canteen. She drank, then looked at him again, her eyes sharp. "Why were you there?" she asked. "At the trading post?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was looking for a man," he said. "One who's been running guns down south. The kind that start wars for coin." She watched him carefully. "And you thought you'd find him among those who sell captives?" He gave a short nod. "The kind of men who trade people for silver usually know where to find him." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "Maybe you found something else instead." He didn't answer. He saddled up again when the shadows grew longer, telling her they couldn't stay past sunset. The air had shifted. The stillness carried a weight that made even the wind seem cautious. As they rode again, the girl glanced behind them often. "They'll track us," she said. "They don't stop. Not until they get what they think belongs to them." The cowboy's eyes stayed forward. "Let them ride," he said. "We'll be gone before their shadows touch this place." She wanted to believe him, but fear lived in her like a heartbeat. By nightfall, they reached a stretch of land where the ground turned rocky, full of dry arroyos and thorn brush. The stars burned cold above them. He stopped near a ridge and pointed toward a small cave half hidden by a tumble of stones. "We'll stay there tonight," he said. She followed without a word. Inside, the air was cool and still, and the faint sound of wind outside made it feel like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. He laid out his blanket near the entrance, keeping his rifle close. She sat farther back, watching the flames he built flicker against the walls. After a long silence, she spoke again. "You said you've seen others chained. Did you ever try to save them?" He didn't look up. "Once," he said. "A woman in a wagon years back. I tried to buy her freedom too, but the man who owned her didn't take coin. He took my brother's life instead." She drew in a slow breath, eyes softening. "And now you keep trying even after that?" He gave a faint smile. "You keep doing what you can, even when it never feels like enough." The girl stared at the fire, her hands trembling just slightly. "They took me from my village months ago," she said quietly. "My mother tried to fight them. She didn't live long after." Her voice broke for a moment, but she steadied it. "They said they'd sell me to a soldier or trader. Said I'd be worth more that way." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "They don't see us as people," she continued, her tone cold now. "Just things to be bartered. And now you—" She paused, her eyes searching his face. "You pay for me like they did. Why should I believe you're different?" He met her gaze evenly. "Because I'm not keeping you," he said. "When we reach the mountains, you can go wherever you please." She studied him a long while, then whispered, "Freedom isn't a place, cowboy. It's a debt no one ever pays in full." The night deepened, and the sound of crickets filled the air again. He stayed awake long after she slept, the firelight painting shadows across his face. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote howled, and another answered. His hand never left the rifle. The world had taught him not to trust silence. When dawn came, it came pale and restless, with the cry of birds overhead. The cowboy rose first, saddled the horse, and woke her with a nod. "We keep moving," he said. She climbed up behind him, her face unreadable, and they rode toward the rising sun. By midday, they reached the edge of a dry riverbed. The cowboy dismounted and studied the ground. Fresh tracks, hooves, and plenty of them. He crouched low, brushing the dirt with his fingertips. "They're close," he muttered. She leaned down from the saddle, her voice low. "Can we make it?" He looked up, his expression calm but hard. "We can try." He led the horse through the shallows of the riverbed, leaving as little trail as possible. The sound of distant riders carried faintly through the wind. She gripped the saddle horn, her heartbeat quickening. They followed the riverbed until the sun began to drop again, painting the sky in red and orange. The cowboy stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. A faint sound came from behind, a whistle short and sharp. He turned his head slightly, then cursed under his breath. "They've split up," he said. "Some ahead, some behind." The girl's eyes widened. "Then what do we do?" He pulled the rifle from its sling. "We ride like the devils on our heels." She didn't argue. The horse lunged forward, racing over the rocks as shadows closed in from both sides. The land ahead rose into jagged hills, their edges dark against the setting sun. The chase drove them deeper into the wild country, where the ground broke into canyons and the air grew thin. The girl looked back once and saw riders silhouetted against the glow of the dying day. Her breath caught in her throat. "They're coming!" she shouted. The cowboy urged the horse faster. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady even now. "We're not done yet." The sound of hooves behind them grew louder, echoing through the canyon walls. Dust filled the air, choking and heavy. Every turn they made seemed to narrow the space between them and their pursuers. Then, just as the last light slipped below the horizon, they reached the mouth of a narrow pass, a slit between two cliffs that barely allowed the horse through. The cowboy turned sharply, guiding them inside. The walls closed around them, tall and silent. The girl glanced back. The torches were still there, glowing like angry eyes in the distance. She whispered something under her breath, a prayer or a warning, he couldn't tell. The cowboy looked ahead, his jaw set, and the horses breathing loud in the confined space. They rode until the darkness swallowed even the stars. When they finally stopped, the girl slid down, her legs shaking. She leaned against the rock, her eyes wide. "Where are we?" she asked. "Somewhere they won't find easy," he said. He dismounted, checked his rifle again, and listened. The wind moaned faintly through the pass, carrying with it the scent of rain and dust. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "If we're lucky, they'll turn back by morning." She stared at him, her voice soft but trembling. "And if we're not?" He met her gaze, the firelight of his match flickering between them as he lit a small flame to see. "Then we fight." The pass narrowed until even the wind had to squeeze through it. The cowboy led the horse by the reins, stepping careful over loose stones. The girl walked behind him, one hand on the wall, the other on the blanket tied about her shoulders. The rock held a cold that sank into bone, but the air beyond smelled like wet sage and pine. Somewhere ahead, the pass would open into higher country. He knew that from old rides he didn't talk about. He halted at a bend where the cliff leaned over like a roof, and there they rested, sharing a strip of dry meat and a swallow of water that tasted of tin and long roads. Neither spoke much. Every sound felt costly in a place like this. When the moon slid free of cloud, the girl crouched by the wall and traced a shape in the dust. Not a picture so much as a path, a crooked line, a fork, a mark like a bird. He watched her hands without asking, reading the same way he read sign on open ground. "This is a warning," she said at last. "My people carved it on the high stones when a path hides danger." She touched the bird mark, eyes from above. He studied the rim of the pass, sharp against the pale sky. "Ridge watchers," he said. "Could be the men chasing us, could be others." She nodded. "In these hills, others is worse. They come quiet and leave nothing but footprints you cannot follow because they walk on rock." They moved again, slower now, setting their boots where the stone held a little grip. The horse slipped once, and the cowboy caught the bridle fast, breathing steady until the animal found its feet. The girl glanced up and froze. He followed her gaze and saw a small shape on the rim. Not a man. A metal disc on a pole, black against the sky. He clicked his tongue once, and the girl ducked back under the rock. He took a knee, lifted his rifle, and studied the rim through the sights. The disc didn't move. A signal plate, old army style, left from some patrol or put up by smugglers who learned from soldiers. He lowered the rifle with a tight jaw. "We are in a throat and someone owns the voice," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. She understood. When the pass widened into a bowl, the walls fell back and pines stood in a scattered ring. The ground held a trickle of water and a churned patch where horses had milled. He knelt and laid his palm to the damp. The prints were not yet 2 hours old. Shod hooves, 4 or 5 animals. He rose and scanned the trees. The girl stepped nearer his shoulder without thinking. "We cut across the slope," he said. "Keep the creek between us and their line. If they're waiting, they'll take the center." She studied the slope, then pointed to a low saddle between 2 knuckles of rock. "There," she said, "a game trail. The deer use it when the snow comes." He nodded once and they angled that way, moving with the quiet of people who learn from land instead of trying to fight it. They reached the saddle at dusk. Below them, a shallow valley opened, full of dark timber and pale meadows. The cowboy's eyes caught motion on the far side. 3 riders, small as ants, crossing a strip of grass, then gone into trees. He counted heartbeats and saw a 4th, lagging. He did not see torches. Smart men didn't show fire when they were close. He eased the rifle strap, then stopped because the girl had turned her head as though listening to a song buried in the wind. "What?" he asked. She closed her eyes. "Shoes on stone," she said. "Behind us." He didn't hear it at first. Then he did, faint and quick. Someone was climbing the ridge they had left, trying to get above them. They dropped into the timber. The cowboy cut a line across the slope that kept them in the shadows and left little sign. The girl moved like a windstepper, picking ground that held leaves instead of dust. The horse followed with a patience that comes from long miles. When they reached a hollow full of deadfall, the cowboy raised his hand. "Down," he whispered. They slid into a pocket between two logs. The valley held its breath with them. A minute later, a rider ghosted along the ridge they had crossed. He wore a blanket roll and a hat that was more brim than crown. The man paused and stood in his stirrups, trying to read the slope. He had the stillness of a hunter and the casual seat of someone born to saddle. The girl's fingers closed on the wood until her knuckles paled. The rider moved on. When he vanished, the cowboy didn't rise. He waited the count of 100, then another, the way an old scout once taught him in a country where impatience could kill. When he finally stood, the girl let out a breath she had held too long. "They are not traitors," she said. "Not all of them." He nodded. He had seen the way the man's eyes touched the country. That was not a merchant's look. "Gun runners' boys," he said. "Or men who work both sides. They stand near the soldiers by day and sell to raiders at night, then cry to the law about the cost of peace." She looked at him. "This is the man you hunt." He didn't answer. The hunt felt different now. It had a second edge. They made camp in a cut where the wind could not reach. The cowboy gave the girl a small tin cup of coffee that he had stretched by boiling grounds twice. She sipped it, grimaced, then drank again. The fire was a smudge, no more than a glow hidden under stones. He sat with his back to a pine and talked for the first time about his brother. A boy with a bright rope swing laugh who ran cattle like they were dancers and died kneeling in the dust beside a wagon because a man with winter eyes wanted to prove a point about ownership. The girl listened without interruption. When he finished, she stirred the embers with a twig. "Grief is a rider who never dismounts," she said. "You can share the saddle or try to throw him. Either way, he goes where you go." He gave, a short breath that could have been a laugh if the road had been kinder. They slept in turns. Close to dawn, the cowboy woke to the lightest scrape of leather. He rolled to a knee, rifle up, and stared into the gray. From the trees stepped not the watcher from the ridge, but a boy, barely grown. Blanket over his shoulders, hat too big, a pistol on a cord that looked more charm than tool. The boy saw the rifle and froze. The girl's hand touched the cowboy's sleeve, steady but firm. "He's one of ours," she said softly. "From a village near mine. I know his face." The boy's eyes flicked to her and widened with a flash of relief and fear in equal measure. He spoke in her language, quick. She answered slower, then turned. "He tracks for the mission stores," she said. "He saw the men in the valley and followed. He says more come on the north rim. He says there is a woman with them who binds wounds and asks questions." The cowboy lowered the rifle a fraction. A camp healer with the gun runners meant trouble or opportunity. He asked the boy's name, got a short sound that the wind carried away, and asked where the woman stayed. The boy pointed toward the far timber where a creek cut bright through the dark. The cowboy made a choice that felt like stepping onto a bridge at flood. "We go," he said. The girl looked from him to the boy, then nodded. The boy led, moving with a rabbit's caution and a fox's nerve. They reached the creek by cradle steps, keeping to shadows. Smoke drifted in a thin line above the willows. Voices came and went on the wind. The cowboy left the girl and the boy under a shelf of rock and crawled forward on his belly until the camp lay in a shallow bowl beneath him. 5 bedrolls, 2 horses ground-tied. A man in a sheepskin coat sleeping with 1 boot on, another on watch, bored, scratching at a beard. And there, in the curve of a fallen log, a woman with a canvas roll open across her knees. She cut strips from a white shirt to make bandages. Her hair was tied back. Her hands moved gentle and quick. She looked like someone who had seen enough blood to call it by first name, and enough lies to know how to price them. He slid back to the rock and told the girl what he had seen. She pressed her lips thin. "If she is with them, she belongs to them," the girl said. "Or she is a debtor who pays with skill." The boy shook his head, whispering something that made her eyes flicker. She turned to the cowboy. He says she came to a river village after a fever took half the children. She brought herb bundles and needles and told the men to boil water before touching the sick. They laughed. Then they did it because she did not stop talking. Some children lived. The cowboy rubbed his jaw. A healer who traveled with wolves, might be a prisoner or a shepherd who found the only flock that would not chase her out with rocks. Either way, she knew the valley and the men. They watched until noon, then angled away to avoid the camp and climb a ridge that gave them sight of the northern rim. Along the spine of rock, far as a rifle shot from the creek camp, lay a line of stones stacked waist high. Behind them moved men in pairs, not their hunters. These wore army coats with the buttons pulled and the insignia stripped, scouts or deserters borrowed from the fort and returned in a color the law liked better on paper than in daylight. They had a glass on a tripod, and every few minutes one would bend to it and call a bearing to a scribbler who marked a little book. The girl watched with a hard face. "They count us like cattle," she said. The cowboy studied the glass and the way it pointed again and again toward the same notch, the pass they had used. He felt the valley closing its hand. 2 nets, he said. Gun runners on the creek, soldiers or men who smell like soldiers on the rim. We stand in the middle. The boy shifted his weight, eyes wide. The cowboy touched his shoulder. "You go back to your people," he said. "Tell them to pull their camps farther into the timber and not light fires at night." The boy said something that rose and fell, a protest. The girl answered firm and the boy's jaw set. He ran like a shadow through shade and was gone. They chose to skirt the rim men and swing back toward the high meadows where spring snow still lingered in patches. The ground there held fewer prints and more sky. On the way they found a burned wagon, 2 wheels sunk into mud like tired eyes. The iron hoops were warped. A tin cup hung from a nailhead. The girl stood beside it a long time, then took the cup down and held it like a small grave marker. "My uncle worked a freight train that passed this way," she said. "He told me a story about a wagon that burned without a fight. No arrows, no shot holes, but everything dead that breathed." The cowboy glanced at the scorched bed, saw the outline of a chest against the boards. "Powder," he said. "Or whiskey cut with fire." She shook her head. "Or a warning." They found sign that the wagon had traveled with others. Deeper grooves in the grass, scattered oats where a bag tore. New tin cut from old cans and hammered into tags hung on low limbs, each stamped with a small star. The girl fingered one and frowned. The cowboy pocketed it. He knew that star. Not the government's, but a copy used by men who liked to be mistaken for law in daylight and forgotten by night. He felt the trail that led back to the trading post and forward to something bigger than a sail in a dusty room. Farther along, they crossed a meadow where someone had staked a circle of saplings and tied bits of fabric in the 4 directions. The girl stepped around it, careful. "A place to ask for protection," she said. He nodded and did the same. By twilight, they reached a ridge that looked down on a hollow full of horses. 20, maybe more. A corral of ropes and men with rifles across their knees. On the far side, tents. In the center, a pole with 2 lanterns hung one above the other like eyes. The cowboy felt the muscle in his jaw jump once. He had seen such camps before. Moving warehouses. Buy from one side, sell to the other. Take a little tax for safe passage and a little blood for silence. He counted the guards, the rifles stacked near the big tent. The shape of a crate with stenciled letters he could not read from this distance but already knew the feel of. The girl said nothing. Her anger was not loud. It sat beside her like an old friend. They lay there until the ridge shadow swallowed them. A bell clinked in the hollow as a horse tossed its head. Laughter rose near the big tent. Then a voice the girl recognized floated up. The trader from the post, the one who let $3 ring against wood and acted like nothing in the world ever made a dent in him. He spoke of a delivery due by dawn. He spoke of a buyer who wanted tools and powder, and a small iron piece with a crank that could spit faster than 10 men on a line. The cowboy felt cold settle into his chest. The war he had been trying to step out of kept finding new boots. They slid back from the ridge in silence, each thought turning like a wheel in deep mud. Down in the hollow, a lantern was raised and carried toward the horses. The healer woman stepped into view near its edge, head bent as she checked a bandage on a man's arm. She looked up once toward the ridge as if she felt eyes on her. The cowboy's breath sat hard in his throat. He did not believe in fate. He believed in signs left by men who thought they were clever, and mistakes made by those who thought they were not. Still, the way the woman paused and narrowed her gaze toward the exact patch of brush where he lay made his skin prickle. They withdrew into the trees and made a Cold camp on a shelf of earth that smelled of pine pitch and wet stone. The girl broke a piece of bread the boy had pressed into her hand before he left, and they ate it in halves so small they felt like lies. The cowboy stared at the dark between trunks and laid out the pieces of the board in his head. A camp too big to hit straight. A healer who moved between men like a blade wrapped in cloth. A line of rim watchers counting hours. A boy running home through a valley full of teeth. And the girl beside him, whose life had become the line all the others crossed to learn what kind of men they were. Near midnight, a single shot cracked from far off. Then a second. Not a fight, a signal. The valley answered with a coyote's cry that was not a coyote. The cowboy rose and touched the girl's shoulder. "They know we are in the hills," he said. Her eyes were calm. "Then let the hills decide who they keep," she answered. He did not sleep after that. He listened to the wind carry news from places he could not see. He watched the stars move like slow riders on a river of ink. And he waited for dawn to pull color back into the world and show him where the next step had to land, knowing that every choice from here would take something he did not yet know he could spare. The night clung to the valley like a secret that didn't want to be told. A cold mist rose from the riverbed, curling around the trees, softening every sound until even the horse's breath seemed distant. The cowboy sat awake against a boulder, rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of campfires far below. The gunrunner's camp was still alive, shadows moving around the tents. He could see men laughing near the lantern pole, their shapes shifting with the flicker of light. The healer woman moved among them, her head bowed as she carried a pail from one tent to another. Every time she turned, the firelight touched her face, and something about her stillness struck him harder than any bullet could. The Apache girl slept lightly beside the embers of their small, hidden fire. Every so often she stirred as though she were back in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. When she finally opened her eyes, the cowboy was still watching the lights. "You don't sleep," she said softly. "Sleep's a luxury for folks who have nothing left to lose," he answered. She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting the dying glow. "You want revenge," she said. He shook his head. "I want peace. But peace don't come free in this country. Somebody always pays first." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked toward the camp. "The woman down there," she said. "You watch her like she holds your past." The cowboy didn't answer right away. "She might hold someone else's future," he said. The girl frowned. "She's one of them. Maybe," he said. "Or maybe she's the reason they're still alive enough to sell to others." Sometimes mercy hides in the same tent as sin. A sudden crack split the silence. A rifle fired somewhere close. Both of them ducked low. A second shot followed, this time echoing from higher ground. The cowboy crawled toward the ridge edge, heart pounding. He saw movement, two riders tearing through the trees, one chasing, one fleeing. The one ahead wore no hat, only a loose shirt that flapped like a torn flag. A glint caught in the moonlight, chains around the wrists. The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Another captive," he muttered. The girl crept beside him. "They're running for the river." He watched a third rider appear behind the first two, rifle raised, aiming low. The shot that followed echoed long and hollow. The leading figure stumbled and fell. Before the sound died, the cowboy was already on his feet. "Stay here," he said. She caught his arm. "If you go down there, they'll see you." He didn't stop. "They'll see me if I don't." He ran through the brush, the sound of breaking branches swallowed by the wind. The slope was steep and slick with dew. He slid halfway down before catching his footing again. When he reached the clearing near the river, one of the riders was gone. The other stood over a body. The man's coat was the color of dust, his boots army issue. He looked up when the cowboy stepped into the moonlight. "You're far from town," the man said, his voice even. "Trail's open to anyone," the cowboy answered. "Looks like you closed it for someone." The man nudged the fallen figure with his boot. "Thief," he said. "Tried to take a horse." The cowboy crouched, checking the man on the ground. A young face, maybe 20, skin marked with the same tribal ink as the girl's. He wasn't dead yet. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. The cowboy looked back up. "Doesn't look like much of a thief to me." The soldier smiled thinly. "Maybe you're new to these hills. Outlaws come in all colors." The cowboy's voice turned cold. "And killers come in uniforms." The man's hand went to his holster, but he didn't draw. "Careful who you insult, stranger. Law's thin out here. Folks like you disappear without much talk." The cowboy stood slowly. "Then I guess I'll have to keep talking." His hand hovered near his revolver, and for a long moment the night held its breath. Then something shifted behind them, a faint snap of a twig, a shadow moving in the trees. The soldier turned his head just enough for the cowboy to see the chance. The fight was fast, ugly, and silent. When it was over, the soldier lay face down, his rifle half buried in the mud. The cowboy wiped the blood from his cheek and turned back to the wounded man. The captive was awake now, breathing hard, whispering something in Apache. The girl appeared then, breathless, having followed despite his warning. She knelt beside the boy, pressing her hand over the wound. "He's from my village," she said quietly. "He shouldn't be here." The cowboy looked toward the campfires below, then back at her. "Seems your people got caught in someone else's war." She didn't answer. Her eyes were on the wound, her face calm but pale. "He was spying," she said. "He came to see who was buying guns." The cowboy helped lift the boy to his feet. "We can't stay here," he said. "They'll come looking for him." The girl looked toward the hills. "There's a place my mother told me of. A cave behind the waterfall 2 miles east. Only our people know it." He nodded. They moved together through the brush, the sound of water growing louder with every step. Behind them, the glow of the camp flickered like fire through smoke. By dawn, they reached the falls, a thin silver stream pouring over black stone. The girl guided them behind the sheet of water to a hollow in the rock. It was dry and cold, the ground scattered with old ashes. They laid the boy down and the cowboy bound his wound as best he could. The girl watched in silence, her face unreadable. "You've done this before," she said softly. He nodded. "Too many times." When he was done, she leaned close to the boy, whispering in their language. After a while, she turned. "He says the gun runners made a deal with the man from the fort. They sell the weapons north, but the soldiers take their share." The cowboy's eyes darkened. "That's why they're counting the land," he said. "Mapping routes for both sides." The cave filled with a heavy silence. The cowboy leaned against the wall, lost in thought. "That woman," he said after a while. "The healer, they trust her." The girl met his gaze. "You think she's the key?" "I think she's the door," he said. "We need to know which side she opens to." The boy stirred, mumbling something weakly. The girl bent down to listen. "He says they're planning to move at sunset," she whispered. 2 wagons full of rifles. They'll head east through the canyon road. The man from the fort will meet them there." The cowboy rose, grabbing his hat. "Then we've got till sundown to stop them." The girl frowned. "3 of us against all of them?" He looked at her, steady and sure. "No," he said. "1 of us goes in. The rest stay alive long enough to get him out." She shook her head. "You'll die." He smiled faintly. "I've heard that before." He started to leave, but she stepped in front of him. "If you go alone, you won't come back." "If I don't go," he said, "none of us will have anywhere left to come back to." The sound of water roared behind them, the sun just starting to cut through the mist outside. The girl stood still for a long time, then reached down and took the soldier's knife from the floor. "Then I'm going too," she said. "You'll need someone they don't expect." By late afternoon, they stood again above the valley. Smoke drifted from the gunrunners' camp. Men loaded crates onto wagons while the healer walked among them, her face pale in the setting sun. The cowboy watched her through his rifle scope. "She's signaling," he said suddenly. The girl looked. The healer paused near a wagon, wiping her hands on a rag, then tossed it aside. Once, twice, 3 times, the same motion. The girl's eyes widened. "That's a warning sign from the old missions," she said. "She's not with them. She's trying to warn someone." Below, a rider in a military coat appeared at the canyon edge, leading 4 soldiers. "The fort's men." The cowboy's grip tightened on the rifle. "There's your deal," he muttered. "Guns for peace, death for coin." The girl touched his arm. "If you fire now, they'll kill her." He exhaled slowly. "Then we'll have to make them look the other way." They moved down through the rocks, quiet as shadows. The camp grew closer, the smell of horses, sweat, and black powder filling the air. The cowboy crouched behind a crate while the girl slipped around the back of a tent. He watched her disappear into the smoke, every second feeling longer than the last. The soldiers were arguing with the traitor now, their voices sharp. The healer stood off to the side, her hands clenched. The traitor shouted something and kicked over a crate, spilling rifles into the dust. The soldiers turned their guns toward him. The cowboy's pulse quickened. The girl appeared near the wagons, slipping behind the healer. She pressed the knife into the woman's hand and whispered something. The woman's eyes widened. Then the traitor drew his revolver and fired. The shot tore through the air, striking one of the soldiers. Chaos erupted. The camp exploded into shouting and smoke. Horses reared, men ran, and the sound of gunfire filled the valley. The cowboy raised his rifle, sighted on the trader's chest. But before he could shoot, a bullet splintered the crate beside him. He ducked, rolled, and fired back. The trader dropped to his knees, clutching his side. But the fight wasn't over. More riders thundered from the ridge, drawn by the sound. The girl shouted his name, pointing toward the canyon road where the wagons had started to roll. The healer was with her, trying to pull the boy, now awake, from one of the wagons. The cowboy ran toward them, dodging through the chaos. Bullets whined past his head, horses screamed, and smoke stung his eyes. The healer stumbled, nearly falling, and the girl caught her arm. Together they pushed the boy toward the rocks. Behind them, the trader, bleeding but alive, lifted his gun again. The cowboy saw the flash, saw the girl turn, and time slowed to nothing. He dove, knocking her down as the shot rang out. Dust rose around them, hot and sharp. When it cleared, the trader was gone, but his men were regrouping, their shouts echoing through the canyon. The girl pushed herself up, eyes wide. "We can't stay here," she said. The cowboy glanced back at the wagon still rolling toward the road, the crates full of rifles bouncing with every turn. "No," he said, "but we can stop them." He looked at the girl, then at the wounded boy. "Get her to safety." She grabbed his arm, her voice breaking. "You'll die down there." He gave her a thin smile. "Maybe, but if I don't, a lot more will." He turned toward the canyon, the last light of day cutting across his face like a brand. The sound of hooves grew louder again. The girl called after him, but he didn't stop. He was already running toward the fire. The canyon was filled with the sound of thunder, but it wasn't the sky. It was hooves pounding, wagons crashing, and men shouting over gunfire that rolled through the cliffs. The cowboy ran through the smoke, his coat torn, rifle clutched tight in his hands. The air burned with gunpowder and dust. One wagon had already tipped, rifles spilling into the sand, black powder cans rolling down toward the stream. He could see the rest still moving toward the pass, where the soldiers' path met the gunrunners' road. If they reached it, the trade would happen, and another war would spark before sunrise. He reached the fallen wagon first. The horses screamed, tangled in their own reins. The cowboy cut them loose, patting their flanks to calm them before turning to the crates. He pried one open, saw the metal glint of repeating rifles packed tight. His jaw set. He took one of the powder kegs and rolled it toward the edge, then reached into his pocket for the small tin of matches he carried. The girl's voice echoed faintly behind him, calling his name, but he didn't stop. He struck the match once. It flickered, died, then caught on the second try. He looked down at the tiny flame and whispered something under his breath, something between a prayer and a promise, then tossed it onto the ground where the black powder trailed. The spark ran fast, faster than a horse could ride. He turned and ran, leaping over a fallen crate just as the explosion hit. The ground shook, a cloud of fire rolling through the canyon, swallowing the wagons, the road, and the deal that had brought them all here. The sound carried for miles. The blast threw him hard against the rocks. For a long while, he didn't move. The smoke rose around him in slow, heavy waves. When he finally opened his eyes, the light had changed. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting everything in red and gold. He tried to stand, but his leg gave out, pain slicing deep. He pressed his hand against the wound and steadied his breath. Through the haze, he could see shapes, two figures running toward him. The girl was first, her hair wild, her face streaked with dust and tears. The healer followed, supporting the wounded boy. The girl dropped beside him, her hands trembling. "You're hurt," she said, voice breaking. He smiled faintly. "Just a scratch." She glared at him through the tears. "You always lie." He tried to laugh, but it came out weak. "Only when someone's worrying for me." She pressed her hand against the bleeding and looked at the healer. "Help him." The woman knelt, tearing a strip from her sleeve to bind the wound. "You shouldn't be alive," she said softly, almost in disbelief. He glanced toward the burning wreckage. "Neither should they," he said. "But the land deserves a quiet night for once." Smoke drifted upward, curling into the sky. The girl looked at the fire, then at him. "It's over," she whispered. "They can't sell what's left." He nodded slowly. "Maybe not here. But men like that, they always find another canyon, another buyer." Her eyes hardened. "Then we'll keep finding them." He looked at her, tired but proud. "You sound like someone who knows what freedom costs." She met his gaze. "You taught me." The healer finished wrapping the bandage and sat back, exhausted. The boy leaned against her, breathing heavy but alive. "You saved him too," she said quietly. "He'll see another sunrise because of you." The cowboy looked at the boy, then at her. "And what about you? You had chances to run. Why'd you stay?" She smiled faintly, her eyes full of something soft and sad. Because someone has to stay behind to tell the truth, she said. And someone has to remember the ones who didn't. The wind picked up, scattering ash through the air. The girl helped him to his feet. He limped toward the edge of the canyon, staring out at the horizon. The plains stretched endless before them, glowing under the fading sun. Behind them, the sound of fire crackled over what was left of the camp. The healer stood beside the boy who was watching silently. None of them spoke for a long while. The moment felt like the earth itself was taking a breath after too long holding it in. When darkness settled, they made a small camp farther from the smoke. The cowboy leaned back against a boulder, the stars slowly filling the sky above. The girl sat across from him, her face lit by the small fire they dared to keep. The healer was tending to the boy, humming softly under her breath. For the first time in days, the air carried no scent of gunpowder, only pine and the faint sweetness of sage. The girl looked at the cowboy. "What will you do now?" she asked. He stared at the flames. "Same as always. Ride where the trouble starts before it spreads too far." She tilted her head. "You don't ever stop, do you?" He smiled, a tired kind of smile. "Stopping never suited me. I'd start thinking too much." She shook her head, but there was warmth in her eyes. "You think plenty. You just don't want anyone to see it." He chuckled softly. "Maybe that's true." He glanced toward the healer. "She'll need a place. Maybe there's a settlement north where she can start again." The girl's voice lowered. "And me?" He looked at her, studying her face in the firelight. "You don't need anyone to tell you where to go. You've already walked out of chains once. The rest of the world's waiting for you." She was silent a long moment, then said, "Maybe I'll ride a while. There's too much land left unseen." He nodded. "Then you'll do fine. Just remember, the land gives back what you bring to it." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll bring something good." The night deepened, and one by one the stars brightened over the canyon. The healer finally lay down beside the boy who was already asleep. The cowboy stared into the sky, his mind heavy with faces he couldn't forget. His brother, the traitor, the men he couldn't save. The girl noticed the look in his eyes. "You still see them," she said softly. "Every time you close your eyes." He didn't deny it. "Yeah," he said. "But tonight it feels quieter." When dawn came, it came soft and golden. The wind carried the smell of rain somewhere far off. The healer was the first to wake, checking the boy's bandage and whispering a prayer. The girl stood near the stream, her hair catching the light. The cowboy sat by the fire, drinking what was left of the coffee, now cold but comforting. She turned to him. "You'll be leaving soon," she said. He nodded. "Sun's rising. Best time to start over." He saddled his horse, testing his leg with a wince but no complaint. The healer handed him a small pouch of herbs. "For the pain," she said. "You'll need it before the next town." He took it, tipping his hat slightly. "Thank you for more than that." She smiled, then turned away, her eyes glistening. The girl walked up, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I found this by the river," she said. Inside was the silver buckle from the soldier's belt, the one who had fallen the night before. She handed it to him. "Proof," she said, "that the world remembers who tried to make it right." He looked at it, turning it over in his hand, then tucked it into his coat. "Maybe someday it'll mean something," he said. They stood there for a moment, the wind tugging at their clothes, the sun creeping higher. "You sure you don't want to ride with me?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "If I did, you'd never stop watching over me. And I don't want to be someone's reason to keep fighting. I want to be someone's reason to stop." He looked at her, then nodded. "Then you'll find your own trail. Just stay clear of men who buy and sell what they can't understand." She laughed softly. "Like you?" He grinned. "Especially like me." He mounted his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. The girl stepped back, watching as he turned toward the open land. The healer and the boy stood in the distance, their figures small against the hills. The cowboy glanced once more at the girl. "Take care," he said. "You too," she whispered. "Cowboys like you don't come twice in a lifetime." He rode off slowly, the morning light stretching long across the plain. The trail ahead was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. Behind him, the smoke from the ruined camp thinned into nothing, and the sound of the waterfall faded into the wind. The girl stood watching until he disappeared behind the ridge. Then she turned, walking toward the healer and the boy, her steps sure, her face calm. By the time the sun was high, the land was quiet again. Only the echo of hoofbeats lingered for a while, fading into the distance. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a lone rider followed the same kind of road he always did, where dusk met dawn, and a man's only reward for doing what's right was knowing he didn't turn away.